Today, I'm crafting with functionality in mind for both on and off the table. Let's scratch build some ferrotonic incinerators that function as travel containers for more terrain and accessories. Hey everyone, Gabriel with Gabriel's Hobby Studio here. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when I post new videos. I've got several of these Talenti ice cream jars that I'll be using as the main compartment and main body of these incinerators. I'll be making 5 in total today. Before I add on to that main form though, I do want to cut off some bits of these Pringles cans, so that way I can have a kind of tapered or different diameter bottom, similar to how the original model has a smaller foot on it. With these cans, I'm just using the topmost 1.5 centimeters, and I decided to use the tops because the lip is slightly wider than the bottom, and the lid snaps onto this better. This will allow me to have an actual flat bottom on the thing. There are several ways you could go about cutting this out, and you could carefully saw at it with either the knife or the saw, or you could take scissors to it. I'm actually going to be doing something very similar to finger gauge measurements. I'll show you. I've already got the blades started, and I've got the entire line marked around the perimeter of the container, so I know where the blade needs to cut. If I take a hold of the knife and keep the distance of the knife uniform with the top of the container, while that container is pressed into the divot of the palm, I can then rotate the can, keeping the knife in the same position and cutting it at a uniform distance from the edge. This isn't entirely perfect, and you definitely need to go slow with it. As I just stated, you could take scissors, and that would be perfectly acceptable, but I'm just going to use the scissors for cleaning up after I've cut these out. I don't want to bend or crease or squish these cylinders down at all. I want them to stay as round as possible. When it comes to attaching these, I'm just using an effective spot weld, so that way I can make sure that these pieces are in good alignment and not completely skewed off. I can then pop the lid on just to make sure that it stays circular and that the heat doesn't warp it at all. After I've spot welded all of them, I can then go back to the beginning because by then the hot glue has been cooled down and I can properly attach by applying hot glue to the inside perimeter of each of those cans. And with those cooled, I will then apply a small bead of hot glue on the inside lip of the lids, so that way I can attach those to the bottom and they won't pop off at all. Now, to begin adding some detail to these basic cylinders, I'm going to take some more cylinders, paper straws in this case, and I'm going to cut off little small chunks and then cut those in half. So I've got half cylinders that I can glue into the Pringles area. And then it'll leave me with some offcuts that I can then cut down to shape or size and then glue those to the side of the main cylinder. I did struggle for a while actually trying to figure out how I was going to build up from the side of the jar, and I was thinking I could just build up layers of cardstock or cardboard, but then I'd have to edge band the cardboard, and if I didn't line up the cardstock right, then they would have a chance of cracking once I tried to bend it around to the perimeter. Digging through my supply stash, I did find some of these adhesive-backed craft foam sheets, and thought, let's give that a try. The first one, I put the 2 adhesive sections on top of each other to solidify them as more or less one piece, but I didn't do that for the rest of them, because I didn't want to have to sit and wait for each one to cure when I superglued the foam to the cylinder. The adhesive on these are not really that strong, so they're not going to hold up for very long, which I'll start to notice a little bit later, but a little bit of super glue in all the corners holds everything on just fine. I would give you measurements for what I'm doing here, but I just eyeballed where I was putting these straws. I am just putting them right across from each other and not being too particular about the distance between them. And I don't have measurements for the foam either, so I just found what was the most common size, cut several of those up so I could then make the foam sheets and stick them to each other. But then for the rest of them, I just had to measure and cut to fit. With the foam sheets, I did determine some of them would have to be double stacks and some of them would be single stacks, just so that way I've got different levels of texture, and that way it's not just making the cylinder just a little bit bigger. Not sure if that worked out though. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Let me know in the comments below if this worked out okay. Fast forward a little bit because I got carried away with some supposedly small modifications off camera that ended up turning into more work, and then I realized I had to start the camera. Anyway, to briefly catch you up on what I did, I added some bits of plastic canvas around, and in one area I put some plastic canvas on the back of a slotted base and glued that to the foam to make a kind of drain outlet. And I took a pencil and just carved in some panel lines and called it a day. I did look at the original model though for inspiration on the general shape of these panel lines, because I wanted it to be similar-ish, but not entirely the same. What you're seeing me do right now is using a wood burning tool in order to melt the foam and actually create the recesses of the panel lines. I had to play around quite a bit in order to figure out what temperature it needed to be set at, and it ended up being the orange zone. If you're familiar with this type of wood burning tool, then there's a yellow, orange, and red zone for different temperature settings. Tip: if you're going to do this for yourself, a lower setting will cause the metal of the burner to catch on the foam instead of melting through it, and you'll get this kind of dotted texture. Whereas if you were into the orange, which would be a medium, or red, which would be a high temperature, then you can get actual cuts. However, be extremely careful about the red zone, because you might melt completely through the foam and into the plastic of the main body container. Looking again at the original models, they do have a door on them. I wanted to follow along with a similar kind of feature on these, and so off camera I made some templates for the doors, just using one of these popsicle sticks as what the door would be, and then adding some extra thickness around to be the door frame. In the template, I also cut a groove out that's the same thickness as the popsicle stick. This just allows me to trace the perimeter for the size of the doorway, and that slit allows me to mark where the door hinges would be for any of them that I want partially open or open all the way. Here's another tip for you guys. If you're wanting to make your own sci-fi gridded texture walkways and floors, skip out on the plastic canvas, unless you're using some kind of card material, chipboard, etc. It's the same thickness or more than the plastic canvas. You can get a very good floor texture that will actually stick to the surface, and you can get thinner walkways with this drywall tape. Some places might call it fiberglass tape. I thought it would be good to include platforms on all of these, so I'm just going to cover an entire 12 by 12 sheet of this thin chipboard. What I'm doing is I'm applying the drywall tape along the entire 12 by 12, and then on top of that I will be putting on the top pattern, which is going to have the different floor patterns cut out of it. It'll make more sense in a minute. I also made a template for the size of these platforms, and I didn't want to measure it out ahead of time and was too lazy to redo the template, so I just went with this one, and I'm only going to get 4 platforms out of this one 12 by 12 sheet. But it gives me 2 long sections I can turn into walkways later. Like I was saying, the top layer of this chipboard, I'm drawing on the pattern and the shape from the template that I have, and I'm just measuring in a uniform distance from the outside edges to create the outside band, and I'm taking roughly half of that measurement to make the cross sections for the crossed floor tile and the diagonal X floor tile. Because these jars are not perfectly flat, there's a divot on the top. And it just so happens that the chipboard that I'm using is actually a proper thickness to act as a spacer. So I'm going to go ahead and glue little circles of chipboard onto the lids that I'll then glue the platforms on top of. You can see me right now, after I've got the glue on there, I'm pushing it down on the lid and then I'm turning it. Doesn't matter whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise, any way you turn it is going to spread the hot glue out. It's going to stop the glue from being too thick in certain areas, and it'll increase the amount of surface area the glue's in contact with, making it cool down much faster. To glue on the top layer, I'm just using some of this Eileen's tacky glue. I could use PVA, but I wanted something that was a little bit more robust and something that was a little less in the water content, so I went with tacky glue. I just want to try and prevent this from warping as much as possible because these are thinner pieces of chipboard. And to ensure that these don't curl at all in the drying process, they're actually going to get stuck down, and I'm going to use a piece of plastic canvas as a buffer between my weights and the glue, so that way I don't accidentally glue my weights to the thing and then have to make it all over again. A few unused books should do the trick at the moment. Oh, I miss gaming. I did go ahead and just cut these out ahead of time because you didn't need to watch me cut out cardboard. I'll be attaching these in the same ways that I attach the spacers. I'll be putting a circle of hot glue on and then turning the lid on the platform so that way it spreads the glue out and increases the surface area. As a precaution, I will be putting the lids back on again for the same reason that I don't want the hot glue to warp the plastic. Let's make these doors look a little bit more door-like. I've got some of the paper portion of Q-tips, and I'm cutting those down into small chunks that I can then glue on to act as the hinges for the door, and a longer piece in the middle just to make it not flat. And instead of a handle or a latch on the door, I'm just going to be putting the last portion of the door frame on, so that way I can say that there's a small latch that's there that could be keypad, or maybe it's that button on microwaves. You just push it in and then the door pops open. I stated earlier I was only able to get 4 platforms out of that 12x12 sheet that I was using. So for the last one, I'm just going on with the metal portion, which is the bottom of Pringles can, because it's got a nice divot in the middle around the edge and a good lip. For the objects on top, I'm just going through some old bottle lids and other recycled plastics that I have, and I found a pull tab here, the same ones that you would find on paper cartons for half and half, or the paper cartons for milk, cream, etc. This pull tab actually will work really well as the indicator for some kind of a hatch. The other object that I'll be putting on top is just a small cap. I was curious to see if I could get a difference in texture between the raw chipboard and the chipboard if I put a small layer of super glue and squeegeed it across the surface. Normally when you paint a chipboard like this, it pulls up a fuzzy texture from the moisture inside the paint, both whether that's the spray primer that you put on or the brush later on. It tends to fuzzy up anyway. I thought maybe the super glue would stop that and give it more of a hard coat and create a difference between the areas that are covered and not covered. 1, I'm hoping to have a variety of textures. 2, I know that if I put baking soda over top of the areas that are super glue, then it'll cure faster and it'll give me a gritty texture. And 3, I want to see if the super glue is actually going to add any kind of rigidity to these corners. I've gone ahead and primed all of these with a flat red, which actually looks more like a reddish brown color. This gives me a pretty good base to make some old worn down terrain as a starting point. The first thing that I'm going to do is go through and dry brush everything with a little bit of white, so that way I can have all of the edges pop, because I do plan on putting one of my darker terrain washes on this that will then darken down the brown red and then turn the white areas into more of a dark brown color, almost black. And with these lids able to come off, it actually makes it really convenient and easy to dry brush these, because I can do the lids separately and then I can stick my hand inside of the jar and then just dry brush it instead of having to hold on to the side of it or balance it on something and potentially get my fingerprints all over it. There's not going to be anything special about this paint job. It's just going to be really quick, and it's just going to be a series of dry brushes and a wash. And here's what they look like after they've had a chance to dry completely. I really like how the platforms on these turned out. The areas here picked up some dark tones, and some of the areas with the white dry brush are now more of a tan or brown color, whereas the other parts are a mix of dark brown, almost black, with some reddy brown that's really dark and light in areas. There's just a variety of color here. I don't own a proper dark gunmetal color, so I'm just going to have to make my own. I'm taking some iridescent steel from Golden Fluid Acrylics and mixing a little bit of black in it to darken it down. The iridescent steel is a very, very transparent gray with a coarse mica embedded in it, which gives it its metallic sheen. Because it's so thin, I don't need to add a lot of black for it to become really dark. It is very easy to overpower this really fast. Keeping the same dark metal color, I'll just add a little bit of blue and add that to some of my doors, so it's more of a metallic blue color, which would contrast really nicely with the warmness of the rest of the terrain. And on the other ones, I'll be adding a little bit of red to that mix, turning it into somewhere between a purple and a magenta, and that's going to blend in with the rest of the terrain really well. For all the wires, I'm just taking a plain red color and painting the wires that. Next, I'll add some metallics into the textures. I'm using a P3 silver color in order to get this across, as if I used my iridescent steel, because of how transparent it is, I would have to use a lot of paint to get the same effect, and it'd be a waste of paint. That same P3 metallic that I'm using is going to be what I'm going to use to paint the grates or the gridded texture on the platform surfaces, as well as I'm going to nick around the edges to give a little bit of exposed metal look. These incinerators, I think, are going to fit perfectly on the table. And honestly, I've got enough scrap for making these platforms that I can make several railings to go along with these. But I'm going to save that for a different time. I'm really happy with the functionality that this is going to provide. It's not only going to allow me to easily bring some more terrain to the table, but I can easily store additional terrain, little bits of detail here and there. I could probably jam all of my barrels into one of these, and then that leaves the other ones for stairs and ladders, terminals, whatever. I could even go as far as making these into nesting dolls. You know, I'd really like to hear from you guys about what you think. It not only helps me, but it also helps everyone else in the community as well. If you have any suggestions for improvements or things that I could do differently, or just something that you liked or didn't like, then please leave it in a comment below. I do read everything and take it all into consideration. Any little suggestion will help. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when I post new content. As always, have fun, be creative, and happy hobbying.